on to our one other issue with political moves, or two other issues of political moves. We'll talk a little bit about the Supreme Court and the Burr conspiracy. John Marshall's Supreme Court, and then Aaron Burr. We'll kind of chat about these things with regard to their role in the Jeffersonian politics at the time. As the Federalists left office, they were trying to hang on to power. They were kind of grabbing on the fingernails on the desk, kind of being pulled out. John Adams signed a whole series of federal justice appointments that for positions that were created by the Federalist Congress, the lame duck Congress before they were being shipped out with the Democratic Republican landslide of 1800. As Jefferson signed all these and approved them and sent them out, these new judge positions for the nation that were created, some of these appointments were not delivered, and they were actually in the White House upon Jefferson and Madison's arrival the very next day to assume the office of president. Jefferson refuses to deliver the remainder of these appointments. One of these was to William Marbury, and he sues James Madison, sues the federal government, Madison representing them, saying that he ought to be given his judicial appointment. Jefferson is happy to see this case go forward because John Marshall is a man with Federalist leanings, and Jefferson wants to clean out a lot of Federalist ideas within the government, a lot of Federalist persons within the government. Jefferson plans on using this ruling, which ought to be, in his mind, that he's probably doing the wrong thing by holding this letter for this job back. He's going to use Marshall's decision, which Jefferson presumes is going to be in favor of Marbury, as an excuse to say that Marshall himself is politically tainted. He's ruling for political allies of his, and he can maybe even impeach Marshall, or at the very least invalidate the ruling in the court, at best, impeach Marshall and put his own guys in. Marshall's aware of this, and Marshall, as a Federalist and also a constitutionalist, does not want to see the power of the court diminished or weakened. He believes it has a vital role to play in the power of checks and balances. So he comes up with a ruling that actually sacrifices Marbury and establishes what you know in the AP multiple choice section of the exam as judicial review. He says Marbury cannot have his appointment, even though it seems by all indications he ought to because it was written by a previous sitting president. Marshall argues the Judiciary Act of 1801 that actually, or 1789, that created all these additional justiceships was unconstitutional on its own. Since it was unconstitutional and it gave Congress too much power to create extra judge positions, the appointment for Marbury never existed. If the appointment never existed, Marbury has no case. Game over. All done. In so doing, he's ruled for Jefferson. So now Jefferson can't, it's a brilliant political move. Jefferson can't very well go after him and say, no, you've been bad. You gave me exactly what I legally wanted. So Jefferson has to go along with the ruling. And in so doing, it enshrines into precedent of American political thinking and American political machinery the concept of judicial review, a very important AP term, which means that the Supreme Court has the right to oversee decisions of the various branches of government and weigh their constitutionality or legality, and that the court is the final arbiter, the final decider on those issues. It's an extremely important precedent that comes up. Marshall, for his part, is then able to keep his office for about 30 more years and issue numerous Federalist rulings from the bench that you'll see in future lessons, with effects of consolidating federal power, being pro-business in their outlook and leanings, and consolidating the ability of commerce to grow in the United States, generally at the expense of states' rights or state power in many ways, cementing contract law as well as a practice for business stability. Jefferson, though, tries to impeach other justices. It's enough for you to know that he largely fails in this attempt. He largely is unable to, in a nakedly politically ambitious attempt, remove justices without cause, with their only cause being that they are Federalists. So in many ways, the judges might have been less partisan in their rulings because they were scared of Jefferson in some ways, but it shows the limits of federal power. On to the Burr conspiracy, which becomes its own separate little issue to deal with. You see this in multiple choice periodically, so I wanted to pay a small amount of heed to it. The 1800 election showed the need for the 12th Amendment because here is the problem. In 1800, remember how we said the Constitution was originally set up in previous lessons. Whoever got the most electoral votes would be the president, whoever got second most would be the vice president. But electors never had to say who they were voting for. So in the 1800 election, in the big landslide for the Democratic Republicans, the electors all put two names on the ballot: Aaron Burr, Thomas Jefferson. But they never indicated which one they were voting for to be president and which one to be vice president. So as it turns out, there was a tie. Burr and Jefferson both could have legal claim to saying, I should be the president. In a series of votes in Congress, the elections thrown into the House, Alexander Hamilton, of all people, supports Jefferson to be the president because Hamilton felt that Jefferson, while he disagreed with him politically, was a less dangerous man. He saw Burr as ruthlessly ambitious and self-centered and thought that Burr would be too dangerous to the country. So as such, Federalists wind up throwing their support towards Jefferson to make him president, in the irony of all ironies. Burr at this point then becomes the vice president, but we can see some real issues then they're going to lead to the need for the 12th Amendment to specifically lay out separate categories for president and vice president. At this point, being stymied in his attempt to have political power as the chief executive, which he could have claimed and didn't, Aaron Burr winds up getting involved in a conspiracy with the Essex junto, which was, a junto is a small political clique, a small political cabal. And what their aspirations were to do was to have a pact to essentially win the governorship of New York for Aaron Burr, and then have Burr unite with New England and tear New England away from the United States and secede from the nation. Word of this deal gets out, and when word of this deal gets out, or the unspoken parts of this deal get out, the deal disintegrates and falls apart. But as a result of it, Burr's reputation is in many ways destroyed. Hamilton, because of his activities in trying to destroy Burr's reputation from the election of 1800 onward, winds up being in a duel, an affair of honor with Burr rather, in which Hamilton is shot and killed by Burr. Burr later on then, after this 1804 killing, the Federalists lose their biggest brain at this point in time. Their biggest political mind at this point in time is gone, which is going to spell bad things for their party. At this point in time, Burr is then involved in a strategy to maybe unite Mexico with the areas of the Louisiana Purchase for the purpose of uniting them as a separate nation that could then secede and break away, and winds up having to face an 1806 treason trial over this. Although he's acquitted, his political power in the United States at that point is nullified. The final aspect of Jefferson's administration that we want to discuss a little bit involves foreign policy, because this is going to segue us directly in to our next two lessons. We've come a long way in terms of political strength since the Articles of Confederation, but that being said, as a nation, we're still very young at this point in time and walking this tightrope between preserving our interests and getting embroiled in affairs that could lead to the destruction of the nation or serious losses in political and diplomatic economic power for us. In terms of the Barbary pirates, Jefferson, the guy who believed, once again, in a small military, has to actually increase the size of the Navy and send naval vessels over to the Mediterranean to deal with pirates who were seizing American neutral cargo ships and holding cargoes and crews for ransom. So the guy who, once again, governing by ideology versus governing based on sound policy, his ideology told him you don't need to have a strong military. Being in office and practice, like Louisiana, his decision there, he became far more pragmatic and said, well, there is a time and place where the military needs to be expanded and used. This being said, he still doesn't want to get in any European war. And there's an increasing problem of the United States trying to remain neutral in a world of great power politics and fighting that is Europe in the Napoleonic era. Napoleon is busy now waging wars against Europeans to try to add them to his imperial domain, his imperial conquest. The Europeans are not fighting to restore a monarchy anymore so much as they were fighting to withstand Napoleon. And the United States, as a neutral party, seeks to engage in friendly, peaceable commercial relations with everybody. Well, the Europeans who are against Napoleon don't want to see America trade with France, because that could strengthen France. And Napoleon doesn't want to see the Americans trade with the rest of Europe who are against him, because that could strengthen them. So you have the United States kind of getting it from both sides, as Europeans either seize our cargoes or seize our ships, and the English now become actively involved in this process. Some 10,000 American sailors get impressed or seized and put into the Royal Navy in the time period from 1800 to 1812. And the most overt of these was the Chesapeake-Leopard affair, where a British naval warship actually opened fire on an American, not a merchant ship, but an American naval warship, an American man of war, stopped it, essentially pulled it over in the high seas, kidnapped some U.S. Navy sailors off it, and told them, you're in our Navy now and you're working for us. To stop this, and to stop the threat of getting us involved into a global, or a world war with Europe that could really spiral out of control of the United States, Jefferson's solution winds up being the Embargo Act. He says, we'll stop trade with all nations. Now, think about that statement. The guy who came from the party that says the government that governs best governs the least is going to put in place a policy that arbitrarily says all American private citizens are forbidden from engaging in commercial trade and business with the rest of the outside world. It's quite a leap, isn't it? And think who's not going to like that the most. Who's not going to like that the most? Who are those commercial, financial, international shipbuilders and traders? It was the New England states, who were Federalist states. So here we are again. We flipped sides. The Federalists, the party that believed in a strong, muscular government, is all of a sudden saying the government is overreaching by doing this. Because what's this do? As American exports drop by 80%, we still kind of trade locally with some of the people around us and a little to West Indies, Mexico and Canada a bit. But other than that, our exports drop. This drops like, it's the equivalent of dropping a neutron bomb on the American economy. When exports drop 80%, it's like curing a nosebleed by decapitation. Yes, I don't have the nosebleed anymore, but I'm also not alive to enjoy it. So it essentially, ships rot in the harbor, businesses and companies go bankrupt, all kinds of people in New England are unemployed, and New England, that Federalist part of the country, is livid about this. And they see this as being a huge governmental overreach. Jefferson also has to contend with members of his own party who agree. Remember, not everybody in the Democratic Republican Party wants to go along with all these changes that Jefferson's bringing by adopting Federalist policies and plans and basically Federalist activities. Jefferson, for his part, is called a sellout by a group of old school Democratic Republicans, if you will, who are known as the Tertium Quid. Tertium Quid is Latin for the third something. And they were led by John Randolph. They said, we've got the Federalists, we have the Democratic Republicans, we're a third something that's actually what the Democratic Republicans originally were. So they're old school Democratic Republicans, they're critical of the Embargo Act, they're critical of Jefferson for keeping the U.S. Bank, they're critical of him for expanding the military, and to a certain extent, they too are critical of this overreach on the Embargo Act. But where this is going to lead in terms of policy and politics and international power, that's going to be a story for our lesson 13, taking us into the second half of the Jeffersonian age beyond his presidency itself.